The laughter stung Josephine Taylor worse than the blistering afternoon sun as she stood in the dusty main street of Pendleton, Oregon, clutching her architectural sketches to her chest, her cheeks flushed with humiliation. It was 1876, and a woman with dreams of designing grand buildings had no place in the rapidly expanding West. At least that's what the town's most influential men had just finished telling her, before erupting into cruel laughter that still echoed in her ears. "Miss Taylor, I admire your enthusiasm," Mr. Holloway, the bank president, had said with barely concealed amusement. "But perhaps you should focus on more suitable pursuits for a young lady. Planning buildings is men's work. Always has been, always will be." Josephine blinked back tears as she hurried down the boardwalk, her dark brown skirts gathering dust. At 22, she had spent years teaching herself architecture from books ordered from back east, sketching buildings late into the night by lamplight, and dreaming of a West built partly by women's vision. But every door had been slammed in her face. "Josephine, wait up." She turned to see her younger sister Martha hurrying toward her, concern etched across her freckled face. "I saw you coming out of the bank." "Did they?" "They laughed, Martha," Josephine said, her voice tight. "Just like the town council last month and the railroad company before that." Martha squeezed her arm. "I'm so sorry, Joe. Perhaps Father was right. Maybe we should move to San Francisco. They say people are more forward-thinking there." Josephine shook her head. "Father only wants me to find a husband there. He's given up on me just like everyone else." As they reached the general store, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them pause. 3 riders were coming into town, dust billowing behind them. The man in front rode tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders and steady posture marking him as someone accustomed to long journeys. His 2 companions were similarly weathered, though one was considerably older with a silver-streaked beard. "The Freeman outfit," Martha whispered. "They've been buying up land north of here. That's Garrett Walker in front." Josephine watched as the men dismounted in front of the saloon across the street. The leader Garrett glanced her way, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. He tipped his hat politely before following his companions inside. "At least he has manners," Josephine muttered, straightening her shoulders and clutching her drawings tighter. "Come on, we need to get home before Father sends out a search party." Little did she know that this chance encounter would change the course of her life forever. The following morning, Josephine sat at her drafting table in the small shed behind their house that her father had reluctantly allowed her to convert into a workspace. Sunlight streamed through the single window, illuminating her latest design and ambitious plan for a new town hall that would never be built. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. "It's open," she called, expecting Martha or their housekeeper, Mrs. Finch. Instead, the tall figure of Garrett Walker filled the doorframe, his hat in his hands. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 28 or 30. His face was tanned from the sun, with lines at the corners of his green eyes suggesting he smiled often. "Miss Taylor, I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Your father said I might find you here." Josephine quickly stood, smoothing her skirts. "Mr. Walker, is it? What can I do for you?" He gestured to her drafting table. "May I?" She hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside as he approached to examine her drawings. "These are remarkable," he said after a moment, running a calloused finger along the lines of her proposed town hall. "The integration of local stone with timber framing. It's unlike anything I've seen before." Josephine blinked in surprise. "You know architecture," a smile creased his face. "My father was a builder back in Missouri. I grew up around blueprints and construction sites." He turned to face her fully. "Miss Taylor, I've come because I heard what happened yesterday at the bank." Heat rose to her cheeks. News travels fast in Pendleton. Too fast sometimes, he agreed. But in this case, it might be fortuitous. I've been looking for someone with exactly your skills. My skills, she repeated, uncertain if this was some elaborate jest. I've recently acquired 5,000 acres north of here. I plan to establish a new settlement, not just a mining camp or a cattle town, but a proper community with real infrastructure. I need someone who understands design, someone with vision. His eyes met hers. Someone like you. Josephine's heart began to race. Mr. Walker, if this is some kind of joke, no joke, Miss Taylor. I'm offering you a job, real work, real buildings, real pay. She studied his face for any sign of mockery but found only earnest determination. Why would you hire a woman when there are dozens of male architects in the territory? Because none of them designed that, he said, pointing to her town hall plans. None of them thought to incorporate cooling passages for the summer heat or considered how the afternoon sun would affect the council chambers. He stepped back, replacing his hat. I don't care if you're a woman, Miss Taylor. I care about building something that lasts. Josephine's mind whirled with possibilities. My father would never allow it. With all due respect, Miss Taylor, you're of age, and I'm offering respectable employment with proper accommodations. My partner's wife, Mrs. Blackburn, would serve as chaperone until suitable arrangements can be made. The possibility of escape from Pendleton and its narrow minds was almost too much to hope for, but years of disappointment had taught Josephine caution. I would need to see this land before I commit to anything, she said carefully. Garrett nodded. Of course. We're returning tomorrow. If you're interested, we'll expect you at the livery at dawn. He turned to leave but paused at the door. Miss Taylor, the people who laughed at you yesterday, they're the same kind who laughed at the idea of a transcontinental railroad or telegraph spanning the country. Don't let their lack of imagination limit yours. With that, he was gone, leaving Josephine standing amid her drawings, heart pounding with something she hadn't felt in years' hope. That evening, the Taylor household was in an uproar. Absolutely not. Jonathan Taylor thundered, pounding his fist on the dinner table. No daughter of mine is going to gallivant across the countryside with strange men. Father, Mr. Walker has offered me legitimate work, Josephine argued, trying to keep her voice steady. This could be my only chance to actually design buildings that will be built. And what of your reputation? What decent man would marry you after you've been living in some wilderness camp? Martha spoke up tentatively. Father, Mrs. Blackburn will be there as chaperone. And Joe isn't getting any offers of marriage here in Pendleton anyway. Their father glared at her. That's because she insists on this foolishness instead of learning proper womanly arts. Jonathan, Sarah Taylor said softly, placing a hand on her husband's arm. Perhaps we should consider this. Josephine has always been different, and Mr. Walker seems respectable. His family has connections in Missouri, and I understand his partner, Mr. Blackburn, was an officer in the war. Josephine looked at her mother in surprise. Sarah Taylor rarely contradicted her husband. Jonathan's face reddened. And what happens when this venture fails, as it surely will? Who will support her then? I will support myself, Josephine said firmly. With the wages Mr. Walker is offering, I can save enough to establish myself elsewhere if necessary. You're as stubborn as your grandmother, Jonathan muttered, but Josephine could see his resolve weakening. After a tense silence, he sighed heavily. You may go see this land, only to see it, mind you. If I don't receive a letter within 3 days confirming decent conditions and proper accommodations, I'll send the sheriff after you myself. Relief flooded through Josephine. It wasn't full approval, but it was enough. Thank you, Father, she said, restraining herself from leaping up to embrace him. Later that night, as she packed her trunks with Martha's help, Josephine felt a mixture of excitement and terror. "What if I'm making a terrible mistake?" she whispered. Martha smiled, folding a dress into the trunk. "What if you're not? What if this is exactly what you've been waiting for? Mr. Walker could be lying about everything." "He doesn't seem the type," Martha said thoughtfully. "Besides, you've always said God gave you this talent for a reason." "Maybe this is the reason." Josephine nodded, running her fingers over her precious drafting tools as she carefully packed them. "I just can't bear another disappointment." "Then don't expect anything," Martha advised. "Go with an open mind and see what happens." Dawn broke clear and cool as Josephine arrived at the livery stable, her trunks loaded on a small cart pulled by their housekeeper's son. Her heart sank when she saw no sign of Garrett Walker or his companions. Had it been a cruel joke after all? Then she heard hoofbeats and turned to see 3 riders approaching Garrett leading the way, followed by the older bearded man and a younger one she hadn't seen before. Behind them was a wagon driven by a woman with iron gray hair. "Miss Taylor," Garrett called, dismounting smoothly. "I'm glad you decided to come." Relief washed over her. "I wasn't sure you were serious, Mr. Walker." "I'm always serious about business," he replied with a smile. "Allow me to make proper introductions. This is Edward Blackburn, my partner." He indicated the older man, who tipped his hat politely. "His wife, Adelaide." The stern-looking woman at the wagon reins nodded. "And my foreman, Daniel Trout." After exchanging pleasantries, Garrett helped transfer Josephine's belongings to the wagon, handling her case of drafting tools with surprising care. "These are important to you," he observed. "They're my livelihood," she answered simply. "They'll be safe with Mrs. Blackburn. You'll ride with her in the wagon." As they prepared to depart, Josephine felt a moment of panic. What was she doing, leaving everything familiar behind on the word of a man she barely knew? But as she looked back at Pendleton with its dusty streets and narrow mines, she knew she couldn't stay. The journey north took most of the day, following the winding course of the Umatilla River before turning into more rugged country. From her seat beside Mrs. Blackburn, Josephine had time to study the landscape and wonder what sort of community could be built in such wild terrain. "It's not what you're expecting, is it?" Adelaide Blackburn said after several hours of silence. "I'm not sure what I expected," Josephine admitted. The older woman's stern face softened slightly. "Garrett has vision, I'll give him that. When he and Edward first showed me the land, I thought they'd lost their minds. But now—" She trailed off, looking toward the horizon. "Mrs. Blackburn, may I ask why Mr. Walker would take such a risk on someone like me?" Adelaide gave her a measuring look. "Garrett lost his mother young and was raised partly by his aunt, a woman who fought to establish a school when everyone said it couldn't be done. He has a soft spot for determined women bucking convention." She paused. "But make no mistake, Miss Taylor, he wouldn't have offered you this opportunity if he didn't believe you could deliver." By late afternoon, they crested a ridge, and Garrett called for them to halt. He rode back to the wagon. "Miss Taylor, come see your canvas," he said, extending his hand to help her down. Josephine climbed carefully from the wagon and followed him to the ridgeline. What she saw took her breath away. Before them stretched a wide valley, bisected by a clear, rushing creek. The western edge was bordered by a dense pine forest, while the eastern side opened to rolling grasslands. The setting sun gilded everything in golden light. 5,000 acres, Garrett said quietly. "From that far ridge to the forest edge, and from the creek northward about 4 miles. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It can be more than beautiful," he replied. "It can be home to hundreds of families, a place where people can build something new, something better than what they left behind." He turned to face her. Will you help me make it real? Looking at the expanse of possibility spread before her, Josephine felt something shift inside her soul. Here was her chance not just to design buildings, but to help shape an entire community from the ground up. Yes, she said simply. I will. Garrett's smile was like the sunrise. Then welcome to Genesis, Miss Taylor. Genesis? That's what I'm calling it. A new beginning. As they made their way down into the valley, Josephine saw that work had already begun. A cluster of sturdy canvas tents and 3 partially constructed log cabins stood near the creek. Men moved about the site, and smoke rose from cooking fires. We have 20 men working now, Garrett explained as they approached, mostly building temporary housing and clearing land. The sawmill equipment arrives next month. Adelaide Blackburn directed the wagon toward one of the completed cabins. This will be yours, she told Josephine. Edward and I are next door, and Garrett's is across the way. The men camp on the north edge of the site. The cabin was small but solidly built, with a proper wooden floor, a stone fireplace, and glass windows, luxuries Josephine hadn't expected in such a remote location. Mr. Walker insisted on the windows, Adelaide explained, noting Josephine's surprise. Said an architect needs proper light. That evening, after settling into her new quarters, Josephine joined the others for dinner around a large fire. The men regarded her curiously but respectfully, many nodding politely as Garrett introduced her as the architect who will design our town. After the meal, Garrett unrolled a large map on a makeshift table, weighing the corners with stones. This is what we have so far, he told Josephine, inviting her to examine it. The creek provides fresh water year-round. We've found a good site for a mill here. He pointed to a spot where the water flowed more rapidly, and the southern slope has the best soil for farming. What about flooding? She asked, studying the terrain. The creek's never risen more than 3 feet, according to local accounts, but we're keeping the main settlement well above that line. Josephine nodded, her mind already filling with possibilities. And what sort of town did you envision? What will the people here do? Timber, primarily at first. The forests here contain some of the finest pines I've seen. But I don't want just another logging camp. I want farmers, craftsmen, merchants. A real community. For the next hour, they discussed his vision, with Edward Blackburn occasionally adding comments about practical considerations. Josephine asked questions about everything from soil conditions to prevailing winds, making notes and rough sketches. You've thought this through more thoroughly than many established towns I've seen, she said finally. I've had 3 years to think about it, Garrett replied. Ever since I first saw this valley. As the fire died down and people began retiring for the night, Josephine felt a hand on her arm. It was Adelaide. Don't stay up too late, the older woman said quietly. Dawn comes early here. But sleep proved elusive as Josephine lay in her new bed, her mind racing with ideas. For the first time in her life, someone was taking her seriously, not just tolerating her hobby or humoring her before dismissing her ideas. Garrett Walker actually believed in her ability. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Each morning, Josephine rode out with Garrett to explore different parts of the property, making notes and sketches of the terrain. In the afternoons, she worked at a table set up outside her cabin, drafting preliminary plans for the town layout. The main street should run east to west, she explained to Garrett on the 4th day, showing him her latest drawings. That way, buildings on both sides get good light throughout the day, and it follows the natural contour of the land. What about the creek flooding? He asked, studying her plans. I've designed a system of drainage channels here and here, she pointed to her drawings. And I recommend building the main street at least 6 feet above the current creek level with proper foundations for all structures. Garrett nodded appreciatively. You've thought of things I never considered. That's my job, Mr. Walker. He smiled at her formality. I think, given the circumstances, you might call me Garrett. Their eyes met briefly before Josephine looked away, suddenly flustered. Perhaps, if you call me Josephine. Josephine, he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. It suits you, strong but elegant. She felt her cheeks warm and quickly returned to the plans. For the first buildings, I suggest we focus on a general store, a proper sawmill structure, and additional housing. The church and school can wait until we have more families. Agreed, Garrett said, seemingly unaware of her discomfort. Though I'd like to include a small building that can serve as both until we have need for separate structures. As they continued discussing the plans, Edward Blackburn approached, his expression troubled. Garrett, we need to talk, he said, glancing meaningfully at Josephine. Privately. Garrett excused himself, and Josephine watched as the two men walked away, their conversation becoming animated as they reached the edge of the camp. She couldn't hear their words, but their body language suggested disagreement. Later that evening, as she was preparing for bed, a knock came at her door. It was Adelaide Blackburn. "May I come in?" the older woman asked. "Of course," Josephine replied, tightening her dressing gown and inviting her visitor to sit in the cabin's single chair while she perched on the bed. Adelaide studied her for a moment before speaking. "You should know that there's been some trouble." Josephine's stomach tightened. What kind of trouble? The kind that happens when men have competing interests. The Hargrove brothers claim they have rights to part of this land, specifically the creek and timber rights. But I thought Mr. Walker Garrett purchased everything legally. He did, Adelaide confirmed. But frontier law is flexible. The Hargroves have influence with the territorial judge and have filed a claim disputing Garrett's ownership of the western section. What does this mean for the settlement? Adelaide sighed. It means uncertainty. Edward thinks we should compromise, give them what they want to avoid a fight. Garrett disagrees. And what do you think? Josephine asked. I think, Adelaide said slowly, that you should be prepared for things to become difficult. This won't be as straightforward as designing pretty buildings. After Adelaide left, Josephine found sleep even more elusive than before. She'd known there would be challenges, but legal disputes over the very land they were building on threatened the entire enterprise. Would all her work be for nothing? Would she be forced to return to Pendleton in defeat? The next morning she sought out Garrett, finding him by the creek where several men were clearing brush. Mr. Walker Garrett, she corrected herself. Mrs. Blackburn told me about the Hargrove claim. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. Did she? I'd hoped to resolve this before troubling you with it. If I'm to design this town, I need to know if we'll actually be able to build it, she said firmly. Garrett motioned for her to follow him away from the workers. When they were out of earshot, he spoke quietly. The Hargroves have no legitimate claim. They're attempting to extort money or concessions because they know the value of what we have here. Then why not give them something small to make them go away? Isn't that simpler than a legal battle? His expression hardened. Because it wouldn't end there. Give bullies an inch and they'll take a mile. Besides, he added, his voice softening, I won't build this community on compromise and corruption. That's the old way. There was something in his conviction that resonated with Josephine. Hadn't she refused to compromise her own dreams despite years of rejection? What will you do? She asked. Fight them legally first. I have documentation of every transaction, surveys, and territorial approval. He hesitated. But the Hargroves aren't known for accepting defeat gracefully. There may be trouble. Should I be afraid? Garrett studied her face. Are you? Josephine considered the question honestly. I'm concerned but not afraid, not enough to abandon what we've started. A slow smile spread across his face. That's why I knew you were the right person for this. You understand that anything worth building requires courage. The moment was interrupted by Daniel Trout calling for Garrett from the camp. I have to go, Garrett said. But Josephine, I promise you this town will be built. Your designs will become reality. As he walked away, Josephine realized that somewhere in the past week, her success had become tied to his in her mind. It wasn't just about proving herself as an architect anymore. It was about helping create something meaningful, a community built on principles she believed in. That night, unable to sleep, Josephine worked by lamplight on detailed drawings for the first permanent structures. If there was to be a fight for Genesis, she wanted to be ready when they won it. 2 days later, a rider arrived from Pendleton with news that the territorial judge would hear the Hargrove claim in 3 weeks. Garrett immediately began preparing documentation and sent Daniel to fetch their lawyer from the Dalles. Meanwhile, work continued on clearing land and preparing building sites according to Josephine's plans. The men, initially skeptical of taking direction from a woman, had quickly come to respect her knowledge and practical approach. Miss Taylor, called Tom Miller, one of the carpenters, as she inspected the foundation trenches for the general store. We've hit rock here just like you said we might. What should we do? Show me, she said, following him to where several men were struggling with the hard basalt that formed part of the valley floor. She examined the formation carefully. We'll need to adjust slightly. Move the corner post 2 feet north to avoid the worst of it. The building will still align with the street as planned. Miller nodded appreciatively. Saves us days of breaking rock. Smart thinking. As she walked back to her drafting table, Josephine noticed Garrett watching her from where he was helping unload lumber from a wagon. What? She asked when she reached him. You're good with them, he said. They respect you. They respect competence, she corrected. I know what I'm doing and I don't waste their time or effort. It's more than that, Garrett insisted. You listen to their concerns, explain your reasoning, and admit when you're wrong. That's rare in bosses of any kind. Josephine felt a flush of pleasure at his praise. My father always said I was too stubborn to admit when I'm wrong. Being stubborn about the right things isn't a flaw, Garrett replied. It's how progress happens. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of riders 3 men approaching from the south. Garrett's expression darkened as he recognized them. Hargroves, he muttered. Stay behind me, please. But Josephine had no intention of hiding. She stood her ground as the men dismounted and approached. The leader, a heavy-set man with a dark beard and cold eyes, looked first at Garrett, then let his gaze linger insultingly on Josephine. Walker, he said by way of greeting. Quite the operation you've got here. Be a shame if it all turned out to be illegal. What do you want, Victor? Garrett asked, his voice level but tense. Just thought I'd see what I'm about to own, Hargrove replied, gesturing to the partially constructed buildings. Judge Parsons is an old friend, you know. Your claim won't stand, Garrett said firmly. I have every legal document required. Victor Hargrove laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. Legal documents can be reinterpreted, or they can burn. His gaze shifted to Josephine. Who's the lady? Don't often see womenfolk in a camp like this. Before Garrett could answer, Josephine stepped forward. I'm Josephine Taylor, the architect for Genesis. Hargrove's eyebrows rose. Architect? Well, Walker, you do collect oddities, don't you? He turned back to Josephine with a mocking smile. No offense, Miss Taylor, but you're wasting your pretty hands on drawings that'll never be built. The only waste would be taking your threats seriously, Josephine replied evenly. This settlement is being built legally and properly, which I suspect is why it threatens you. Victor's face darkened. You should teach your woman to hold her tongue, Walker. Miss Taylor isn't my woman, Garrett replied, his voice dangerously calm. She's a professional doing her job, and she's right. By now, Edward Blackburn and several workers had noticed the confrontation and moved closer, some carrying tools that could double as weapons if needed. Victor noted the gathering men and apparently decided against further provocation. We'll see what the judge says, he said, turning back to his horse. Enjoy playing town builder while you can, Walker. As the Hargroves rode away, Josephine released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I shouldn't have spoken, she said. I made things worse. Garrett surprised her by laughing. Josephine, if you'd cowered behind me, Victor would have seen weakness. Your standing up to him told him we're not intimidated. Still, he seemed dangerous. He is, Edward Blackburn confirmed, joining them. The Hargroves have been running roughshod over this part of the territory for years. They're not used to being challenged. All the more reason to challenge them now, Garrett said firmly. That evening, a council was held around the fire. Garrett explained the situation to everyone, making it clear that there might be trouble ahead. Anyone who wants to leave now, before things get difficult, can do so with full pay and my gratitude, he concluded. I won't hold it against you. There was silence for a moment, then Tom Miller spoke up. I came out west to build something, not run from bullies. I'm staying. One by one, the other men voiced similar sentiments. Even Daniel Trout, who had initially been the most skeptical about working under a female architect, declared, Miss Taylor's designs are worth fighting for. Josephine felt a lump form in her throat at their loyalty not just to Garrett, but to the vision they all now shared. Later, as the gathering broke up, Garrett walked her to her cabin door. You've won them over, he said softly. We've won them over, she corrected. This is your dream, Garrett. I'm just helping give it form. He shook his head. It's become more than my dream now. It's ours, all of ours. Something in the way he said ours made Josephine's heart beat faster. She looked up at him, trying to read his expression in the moonlight. I should get some rest, she said finally. Tomorrow I need to finalize the plans for the sawmill. Garrett nodded, seemingly reluctant to end their conversation. Good night, Josephine. Good night, Garrett. Inside her cabin, Josephine leaned against the door, troubled by her growing feelings for Garrett Walker. She had come here to prove herself as an architect, not to fall for her employer. Yet each day she found herself more drawn to his vision, his determination, and his unfailing belief in her abilities. Focus on the work, she told herself firmly. That's what matters. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. With the hearing approaching, Garrett split his time between preparing their legal case and overseeing the increasingly rapid construction. The foundation for the general store was completed, and work began on the sawmill that would allow them to process timber more efficiently. Josephine threw herself into her designs, often working from dawn until well after dark. Sometimes Garrett would join her, asking questions about her choices or offering insights from his builder's perspective. These sessions often stretched late into the night, their conversation flowing from architectural details to philosophical discussions about community building and the future of the West. I believe towns should be designed for people, not just commerce, Josephine explained one evening, showing him plans for a central square. Shared spaces where families can gather, where community happens naturally, like the plazas in Mexican villages. Garrett asked, leaning over her shoulder to see the drawings. Similar, yes. Europeans have understood this for centuries, that public spaces bind communities together. Garrett nodded thoughtfully. Most Western towns just happen, with no thought beyond the quickest way to extract resources. I want Genesis to be different. It will be, Josephine promised. As they worked side by side, she became increasingly aware of his presence, the clean scent of him, the way his forehead creased when he concentrated, the gentle strength in his hands as they traced lines on her drawings. Sometimes their fingers would brush as they pointed to the same detail, sending an unexpected thrill through her. One night, as a summer storm rolled through the valley, they took shelter in Garrett's cabin while discussing modifications to the church/school building. Thunder crashed outside as rain pounded the roof. The windows should be larger on the south wall, Josephine was saying, for better light during winter months. Agreed, Garrett replied, making a note. What about heating? Winters here can be harsh. I've designed a central chimney system that should. A particularly loud thunderclap interrupted her, making her jump. Garrett smiled. Not fond of storms, not these Western ones, she admitted. They're more violent than what I grew up with. They pass quickly, he reassured her. He rose to add wood to the fire, and when he turned back, his expression had grown serious. Josephine, there's something I should tell you before the hearing. Her heart quickened. What is it? If things go badly, if the Hargroves somehow win, I want you to know that I'll make sure you're taken care of. I have other properties, other possibilities. I'm not concerned about myself, she said. I'm concerned about Genesis. Garrett moved closer, sitting beside her at the table. That's what makes you remarkable. Most people in your position would be looking for guarantees, security. Perhaps I've never had enough security to miss it, she replied with a small smile. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them. Garrett reached out slowly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear that had escaped from her usually neat bun. Josephine, he said softly, I find myself thinking about more than just building a town when I'm with you. Her breath caught. Garrett, another crack of thunder broke the moment, and Josephine stood abruptly. I should get back to my cabin before the rain worsens. Garrett looked like he wanted to say more but simply nodded. I'll walk you. Holding a lantern, he escorted her through the downpour to her door. Before she could escape inside, he caught her hand. Whatever happens at the hearing, I'm glad you came to Genesis, he said. You've made this dream better than I imagined it. She squeezed his hand briefly before pulling away. Good night, Garrett. Inside, Josephine pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks. This was dangerous territory. If she allowed her feelings for Garrett to grow, she risked everything she'd come here to achieve. People would say she'd succeeded only because of her relationship with him, not because of her talent and hard work. Yet denying her feelings was becoming increasingly difficult. Garrett truly saw her in a way no one ever had before. The day of the hearing arrived with a sense of tension throughout the camp. Garrett, Edward, and Daniel would ride to Pendleton, along with their lawyer who had arrived 2 days earlier. Josephine had assumed she would remain behind with Adelaide and the workers, but at breakfast, Garrett approached her. I'd like you to come with us, he said. Your testimony about the progress we've made could be valuable. Are you sure? She asked, surprised. A female architect might not impress Judge Parsons. Perhaps not, Garrett admitted, but your knowledge and expertise will. Besides, he added with a grim smile, I want the Hargroves to see exactly who they're trying to displace. The ride to Pendleton was long and mostly silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what lay ahead. As they approached the town, Josephine felt a curious mixture of anxiety and pride. She had left here in seeming defeat just weeks ago. Now she was returning as a professional with real work to her name. The territorial courthouse was crowded when they arrived. News of the dispute had spread, drawing curious onlookers and those with vested interests in the outcome. Josephine spotted her father and sister near the back and gave them a brief nod before taking her seat beside Garrett at the plaintiff's table. "Nervous," Garrett whispered as the bailiff called for order. "Determined," she replied. Judge Parsons, a thin man with spectacles and a severe expression, entered and took his seat. After preliminary statements from both sides' lawyers, Victor Hargrove took the stand, spinning a tale about verbal agreements and handshake deals that supposedly gave his family rights to the land Garrett had purchased. When it was Garrett's turn, he presented documentation of every transaction, surveys, and official territory records confirming his ownership. The judge examined each document carefully, his expression unreadable. Then, to Josephine's surprise, Garrett's lawyer called her name. "Miss Taylor, please explain your role at the Genesis settlement," the lawyer prompted once she was sworn in. Josephine took a deep breath. "I am the architect for the entire project. I've designed the town layout and all major structures currently under construction." "And in your professional opinion, what stage of development has Genesis reached?" "We have completed foundations for the general store and several residences, begun construction on the sawmill, and established infrastructure, including roads and water access, according to my designs." "Would you consider this significant progress in terms of establishing a permanent settlement?" "Absolutely," Josephine replied confidently. "The work represents hundreds of man-hours and considerable investment. Moreover, each building has been designed specifically for that location, taking into account the unique topography and climate conditions." Victor Hargrove's lawyer rose for cross-examination. "Miss Taylor, where did you receive your architectural training?" Here it was the attack she'd been expecting. "I am self-taught, sir, through extensive study of architectural texts and practical application." "Self-taught," the lawyer repeated with exaggerated surprise. "And Mr. Walker hired you, a woman with no formal credentials, to design an entire town. Doesn't that suggest a certain casualness in his approach to this venture?" Josephine felt her temper rise but kept her voice steady. "Mr. Walker hired me after reviewing my designs and determining they were superior to others he had seen. He judged my work on its merits, not on preconceptions about who should create it." The lawyer smirked. "Or perhaps he hired you for other reasons. A young, unmarried woman living in a remote camp with dozens of men." "Objection," Garrett's lawyer called out. "Counsel is impugning Miss Taylor's character without cause." "Sustained," Judge Parsons said, looking annoyed. "Counselor, confine yourself to relevant questioning." The cross-examination continued, with the Hargrove's lawyer trying repeatedly to undermine Josephine's credibility. Each time, she responded with detailed technical explanations that demonstrated her expertise, refusing to be provoked into emotional responses. By the time she was dismissed, Josephine felt drained but satisfied. She had spoken as a professional, and even Judge Parsons had seemed impressed by her knowledge. After a few more witnesses and closing arguments from both sides, the judge called a recess to consider his ruling. As they waited outside the courthouse, Josephine found herself approached by her father. "Josephine," Jonathan Taylor said stiffly, "your mother and sister have been worried." "I sent letters," she replied. "Did they not arrive?" "They arrived. But words on paper aren't the same as knowing you're safe." He glanced toward Garrett, who was speaking with their lawyer nearby. "This man, is he treating you properly?" Josephine softened at the genuine concern in her father's voice. "Yes, father, Mr. Walker has been nothing but respectful and professional. The work I'm doing is real important." Jonathan studied her face. "You look different, happier, perhaps." "I am happy," she realized as she said it. For the first time, I'm using my abilities as they were meant to be used." Her father seemed about to say more when the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. Judge Parsons did not keep them waiting. "Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, I find in favor of Mr. Walker," he announced. "The Hargrove claim is dismissed as without merit or supporting documentation." Relief flooded through Josephine as Garrett squeezed her hand under the table. They had won. Victor Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage. Parsons, you've been bought." "Mind yourself, Mr. Hargrove," the judge warned. "One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt." As they left the courthouse, Josephine noticed the dark looks the Hargrove brothers cast in their direction. Their victory, it seemed, might come with consequences. That evening, Garrett insisted on celebrating at Pendleton's finest restaurant, inviting Josephine's family to join them. To her surprise, her father accepted. "To Genesis," Garrett toasted, raising his glass, "and to the remarkable woman who's helping bring it to life." Josephine blushed as everyone drank. Throughout the meal, she noticed her father watching her interactions with Garrett with increasing thoughtfulness. When Garrett excused himself briefly, Jonathan leaned across the table. "He's in love with you," he said bluntly. "Father," Josephine gasped, "Mr. Walker is my employer." "Our relationship is professional." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "I've been watching him all evening. The way he looks at you isn't professional, Josephine." Before she could respond, Garrett returned, and the conversation turned to other topics. But her father's words echoed in her mind for the remainder of the evening. Later, as they prepared to return to Genesis, Jonathan pulled Josephine aside. "I may have been wrong about your architectural ambitions," he admitted grudgingly. "You've proven yourself capable. But be careful with your heart, Josephine. Men like Walker have many dreams. Make sure you're not just one of them." Josephine hugged her father, touched by his concern if not his assessment of Garrett. "I will, Father. Thank you for coming today." The journey back to Genesis was more relaxed than their earlier trip, everyone buoyed by their legal victory. Yet Garrett seemed unusually quiet, lost in thought as they rode. "Everything all right?" Josephine asked when they paused to water the horses. "Just thinking about next steps," he replied. "The Hargroves won't take this defeat easily. We need to accelerate construction, establish Genesis as a thriving settlement as quickly as possible." "You think they might still try something?" Garrett's expression was grim. "Victor Hargrove isn't known for accepting legal decisions that don't go his way." His prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. 3 days after their return, a worker discovered that someone had tampered with their water supply during the night, dumping waste upstream from where they drew drinking water. "A warning," Edward Blackburn said as they examined the contamination. "Next time could be worse." Garrett organized round-the-clock guards for the camp. But the incident's continued tools disappeared. A partially constructed wall was pushed over overnight, and a shipment of supplies was mysteriously canceled. "They're trying to delay us, force us to abandon the project before it becomes too established to stop," Garrett explained to Josephine as they surveyed the damage to the General Store Foundation. "What can we do? Build faster," he said firmly. "I'm bringing in more workers from the Dalles next week. We'll work in shifts if necessary." True to his word, Garrett recruited 20 additional workers, and construction accelerated dramatically. Following Josephine's detailed plans, the general store took shape, followed by the sawmill and the first permanent residences. Each completed structure seemed to inject new energy into the settlement. Word began to spread about the new town being built, and occasionally wagons would arrive carrying families looking to settle. Garrett welcomed each one, showing them plots available for purchase and explaining his vision for Genesis. "We'll have a proper school by winter," he told one family with 3 young children, "and a church. Miss Taylor has designed them both." The mother looked at Josephine with surprise. "You're the architect, a woman?" "Yes," Josephine replied, bracing for the usual skepticism. Instead, the woman smiled. "How wonderful! My daughter loves to draw buildings. She'll be so inspired to meet you." These small validations meant more to Josephine than any professional recognition. The idea that her work might inspire other girls to pursue their own dreams added a dimension to her achievement she hadn't anticipated. As summer gave way to early autumn, Genesis began to resemble a real town. The general store opened, operated by a cheerful couple from Sacramento. The sawmill hummed with activity, processing timber for further construction. A dozen families had settled permanently, with more arriving each week. Throughout this period of growth, Josephine continued to refine her designs, adapting to the changing needs of the community. She and Garrett still worked closely together, but both seemed to maintain a careful distance after that night in his cabin during the thunderstorm. Until one evening in late September, when Josephine was working late in the small office that had been built behind the general store. Garrett appeared at her door, his expression troubled. "May I come in?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, setting aside her drafting tools. "What's wrong?" He closed the door behind him and handed her a crumpled note. "This was delivered today by a boy from Pendleton. He said a man paid him to bring it." Josephine unfolded the paper. Written in crude letters was a simple message: "Leave now or burn." "The Hargroves?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Garrett nodded grimly. "Almost certainly. I've doubled the guards, but we can't watch everywhere all the time," she finished for him. "No." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Josephine, I need to ask something difficult of you. I think you should return to Pendleton until this is resolved." She stared at him in disbelief. "You're sending me away." "Trying to protect you," he corrected. "The Hargroves are dangerous, and this threat is against all of us, not just me," she interrupted. "This is my town too, Garrett. My designs, my work. I won't abandon it because of threats. Josephine, please, if anything happened to you." "Nothing will happen to me," she said firmly. "We'll be vigilant, we'll be careful, but I'm not leaving." Garrett looked at her for a long moment, conflict evident in his eyes. Finally, he sighed. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "So you've said before," she replied with a small smile. "It's why you hired me, remember?" "No," he said softly. "I hired you because you're brilliant. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I care for you because you're stubborn and brave and utterly remarkable." Josephine's heart began to race. "Garrett, I know," he interrupted. "I know I shouldn't say this. You're focused on your career, on proving yourself. The last thing you need is your employer declaring his feelings, but with these threats, with the danger." He moved closer, his eyes intense. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you, and I'd never told you how much you've come to mean to me." The sincerity in his voice melted Josephine's carefully maintained reserve. "You've come to mean a great deal to me too," she admitted. "More than I intended, more than is probably wise." Garrett reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Is it unwise to care for someone who sees you completely? Who admires not just your beauty but your mind, your determination? People will say I succeeded only because of personal considerations," she said, voicing her deepest fear. "Let them talk," Garrett replied. "We know the truth. Your talent speaks for itself in every building rising in Genesis." He was so close now that she could see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. When he leaned forward, she met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. "I've wanted to do that since the day you stood up to Victor Hargrove." Garrett whispered when they finally broke apart. Josephine laughed softly. I've wanted you to since the night of the thunderstorm. Their moment of happiness was shattered by shouting outside. Garrett rushed to the window, Josephine close behind. In the gathering darkness, they could see flames leaping from one of the outlying cabins, the one being used to store lumber for the next phase of construction. Fire, Garrett shouted, throwing open the door. Everyone to the creek, form a bucket line. For the next several hours, the entire settlement battled the blaze. Despite their efforts, the lumber store was destroyed, and 2 adjacent structures were damaged. As dawn broke, revealing the extent of the destruction, Garrett gathered everyone in the town square. This was deliberate, he said, his voice carrying across the tired, soot-stained crowd. The Hargroves are trying to drive us out. He paused, looking around at the determined faces. I won't blame anyone who chooses to leave. This isn't what you signed up for. Tom Miller stepped forward. Begging your pardon, Mr. Walker, but this is exactly what we signed up for, building something that matters enough for others to try to tear it down. Murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. My grandfather fought Indians and blizzards to keep his homestead, an older settler added. I'm not letting some bullies with matches drive me from mine. One by one, the residents of Genesis voiced their determination to stay. When they had all spoken, Garrett turned to Josephine, standing quietly at his side. Miss Taylor, he said formally, it seems we need to revise our building schedule. What do you recommend? Josephine straightened her shoulders. We rebuild the lumber store first, but with stone this time, not wood. Make it fireproof. And we accelerate work on the town well so we're not dependent on the creek for firefighting. Excellent suggestions, Garrett agreed. Let's get to work. As the crowd dispersed, he squeezed her hand briefly. Thank you for staying. Wild horses couldn't drag me away, she replied. The following weeks were a blur of intense activity. Josephine revised plans, prioritizing structures that would make the settlement more secure and self-sufficient. Garrett rode to the Dalles and returned with more workers and supplies. The community pulled together, with everyone from children to the elderly contributing to the rebuilding efforts. Meanwhile, the threat from the Hargroves loomed. Garrett sent word to the territorial marshal requesting assistance, but with limited law enforcement spread thin across the vast territory, help would be slow in coming. We need to be ready, Garrett told Josephine and the other settlement leaders one evening. The fire was just the beginning. They're testing us, seeing if we'll break. What can we do? Asked Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the general store with her husband. Train, prepare, stay vigilant, Edward Blackburn advised. Most of us have experience with weapons. We organize watches, establish signals, make sure everyone knows what to do if there's trouble. For the next several days, the men of Genesis practiced with rifles and revolvers, while the women prepared medical supplies and organized evacuation plans for the children. Josephine found herself working alongside Adelaide Blackburn, learning basic medical treatment. I never imagined when I came here that I'd be preparing for a siege, she confessed to the older woman. Adelaide smiled grimly. The West wasn't built by the faint-hearted, my dear. Creating something new always meets resistance from those who profit from the old ways. Like the Hargroves, Josephine said. Exactly. Men like Victor Hargrove don't build, they take. They can't understand people like you and Garrett who want to create. One night in mid-October, Josephine was awakened by Garrett pounding on her door. Riders coming, he said when she opened it, already fully dressed. At least a dozen. Hargroves, most likely. Get to the store cellar with the other women and children. Josephine grabbed her shawl. I'm not hiding in a cellar while you defend my town. Josephine, please, I can shoot, Garrett. My father taught all of us." Before he could argue further, the warning bell began to ring 3 short peals, the signal they'd established for approaching danger. "Stay with me then," Garrett said, handing her a rifle. "But promise you'll take cover if I tell you to." Together they hurried to the edge of town where men were gathering with weapons, taking positions behind barricades hastily constructed from barrels and crates. In the distance, they could see the approaching riders, their torches flickering in the darkness. "Hold steady," Edward called out. "Let them make the first move." The riders stopped just beyond rifle range, and one broke away from the group, approaching alone. Even in the dim light, Josephine recognized Victor Hargrove. "Walker," he shouted. "Last chance to clear out peacefully." Garrett stepped forward, his rifle ready. "This is legally established private property, Hargrove. You're trespassing." "Legal," Victor sneered. "I've got 30 men who say otherwise. You've got, what, a dozen farmers and a woman playing architect. We have legitimate deeds, the law on our side, and people defending their homes," Garrett replied evenly. "Ride away now and no one gets hurt." Victor laughed. "You always were too civilized for the frontier, Walker. Out here, possession is the only law that matters." He raised his arm, and his men spurred their horses forward, several firing wildly as they charged. "Take cover," Edward shouted as bullets whizzed overhead. Garrett pulled Josephine behind a water trough. "Stay down." The defenders of Genesis returned fire, and several attackers fell from their horses. The others scattered, regrouping behind trees and rocks at the edge of town. For what seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, gunfire exchanged between the two sides. Josephine loaded and fired alongside Garrett, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Gradually, she realized the attackers were focusing their fire on the newly rebuilt lumber store and the sawmill, the economic heart of Genesis. "They're trying to destroy our livelihood," she said to Garrett. He nodded grimly. "If they can't drive us out directly, they'll try to make the settlement unviable." A bullet splintered the wood next to Josephine's head, and Garrett pulled her closer, shielding her with his body. "This is too exposed. We need to move." As they prepared to dash to better cover, a new sound cut through the gunfire, hoofbeats approaching from the east, many horses moving fast. Both sides paused, turning toward the sound. "The marshal," Josephine whispered hopefully. "Too many riders," Garrett replied, his expression tense. A large group of mounted men appeared, led by a figure Josephine recognized with shock: her father, Jonathan Taylor, rifle in hand. "Hargrove," Jonathan bellowed. "Back away from my daughter and these good people." Behind him rode at least 20 men from Pendleton, all armed and looking determined. They formed a line between the Hargroves and Genesis, effectively surrounding the attackers. Victor Hargrove's face contorted with rage. "This isn't your fight, Taylor." "You made it my fight when you threatened my daughter," Jonathan replied. "Now drop your weapons or face twice your number." For a tense moment, it seemed Victor might order his men to fight anyway. Then, with a curse, he threw down his gun. His men followed suit. "This isn't over, Walker," Victor snarled as Jonathan's men began disarming the Hargroves. "Yes, it is," said a new voice. A man wearing a marshal's badge rode forward. "Victor Hargrove, you're under arrest for arson, attempted murder, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the ride to Portland." As the marshal and Jonathan's men secured the prisoners, Josephine ran to her father. "How did you know?" she asked as he dismounted. "Your sister overheard the Hargroves planning in the saloon," Jonathan explained, embracing her briefly. "I wasn't about to let them harm my stubborn, brilliant daughter or the town she's building." Tears filled Josephine's eyes at this unexpected validation from the man who had once dismissed her dreams. Garrett approached, extending his hand to Jonathan. "Mr. Taylor, I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed," Jonathan replied, shaking Garrett's hand. "Though we do have some matters to discuss regarding your intentions toward my daughter." "Father," Josephine protested, but Garrett smiled. "I'd welcome that conversation, sir." As dawn broke over Genesis, the residents emerged from their hiding places and defensive positions to assess the damage. Remarkably, no one from the settlement had been seriously injured, though several buildings showed bullet holes and broken windows. "We were lucky," Edward Blackburn said as they gathered in the town square. "Not lucky," Garrett corrected. "Prepared, united, and determined." He looked around at the faces of those who had stood their ground. "This is what makes a community not just buildings, but people willing to fight for something they believe in." In the days that followed, the people of Genesis set about repairing the damage and returning to the work of building their town. With the Hargroves in custody and the territorial governor taking a personal interest in the case after hearing of the attack, the immediate threat had passed. Jonathan Taylor remained for a week, helping with repairs, and Josephine suspected, evaluating Garrett's character. Whatever his conclusions, he departed seeming satisfied, extracting a promise from both of them to visit Pendleton soon. As autumn deepened toward winter, Genesis continued to grow. The school/church building was completed just as the first snow fell, and Josephine found herself teaching basic reading and arithmetic to the settlement's children 3 mornings a week, in addition to her ongoing architectural work. One crisp December evening, Garrett invited Josephine for a walk through town. As they strolled past buildings she had designed, now filled with warmth and life, Josephine felt a profound sense of accomplishment. "It's really happening," she said softly. "It's becoming what we dreamed." "It's becoming more than I dreamed," Garrett replied, taking her hand. "Thanks to you." He led her to the town square, where, to her surprise, a large pine tree had been erected and decorated with simple ornaments made by the children. "Our first Christmas tree," Garrett explained. "I thought we should mark the occasion properly." Beneath the tree was a small wooden box. Garrett picked it up and turned to face her, his expression suddenly nervous. "Josephine, when you first came to Genesis, I offered you a job. Now I'm offering something else." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a small diamond. "I'm offering a partnership in every sense. I love you, your brilliance, your courage, your vision. Will you marry me?" Joy welled up in Josephine's heart. "Are you sure? People will talk, let them," Garrett interrupted. "They've been talking since the day I hired a female architect. What matters is that we know the truth, that you've earned every success through your own talent and determination. That I love you not despite your ambitions, but because of them." Tears of happiness filled Josephine's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Garrett. Yes, I'll marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss, cheers erupted from nearby buildings. They broke apart to find what seemed like the entire population of Genesis watching from windows and doorways. "Were they all in on this?" Josephine asked, laughing through her tears. "Of course," Garrett replied with a grin. "It takes a community to build a life, just as it takes one to build a town." They were married on New Year's Day, 1877, in the newly completed church, with Jonathan Taylor proudly walking his daughter down the aisle and Martha serving as maid of honor. Adelaide Blackburn, who had become a dear friend and mentor to Josephine, sat in the front row wiping away uncharacteristic tears. After the ceremony, the entire town celebrated with a feast in the town square, despite the winter chill. As night fell and lanterns were lit, Garrett led his bride in the first dance. "Mrs. Walker," he said softly, "are you happy with your new title?" "Quite happy," she replied. though I hope you don't mind if I continue to use Miss Taylor professionally. I've worked hard to establish that name in my field. I wouldn't have it any other way, Garrett assured her. You'll always be Josephine Taylor, architect, as well as Josephine Walker, my beloved wife. As winter gave way to spring, Genesis continued to thrive. New families arrived, attracted by reports of the progressive community, where even a woman architect was welcome. Josephine's reputation grew, bringing commissions from neighboring settlements and even from as far away as Portland. In May, as wildflowers carpeted the valley, Josephine shared news of her own with Garrett. They were expecting a child in the fall. "Are you concerned about continuing your work?" he asked as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the buildings of Genesis in golden light. "Not at all," she replied confidently. "Adelaide has already offered to help, and I've been training young Thomas Miller in basic drafting. He shows real promise." She rested her hand on her still flat stomach. "Besides, our child should see that dreams are worth pursuing, no matter the obstacles." Garrett placed his hand over hers. "With you as a mother, how could they learn anything else?" As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, planning not just buildings but their shared future. In the town below, lights twinkled from windows, homes, and businesses that had begun as lines on Josephine's drafting paper and now sheltered real lives, real dreams. "Not bad for a woman who was laughed at for her big dreams," Garrett murmured, kissing her temple. "And a cowboy who believed those dreams could become reality," Josephine added, leaning into his embrace. Together, they had built something neither could have created alone, not just a town, but a community where dreams were valued regardless of who dreamed them. And as their family grew, so too would Genesis, a living testament to what could be achieved when vision and determination joined forces with love. In the years that followed, Josephine and Garrett Walker became known throughout the territory as pioneers in more ways than one. Genesis flourished into a town of over 500 souls by 1880, with Josephine's distinctive architectural style visible in every major building. Their son, Benjamin, was born in October 1877, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Eleanor, both growing up in a community that valued innovation and equality. Josephine's career continued to expand as her reputation spread. By 1885, she had established a small architectural firm in Genesis, training apprentices, including several young women, in her methods and philosophy. Garrett managed their growing business interests while continuing to develop the town according to their shared vision. Victor Hargrove served 5 years in prison for his crimes against Genesis, and upon his release, moved to California, never to trouble them again. Jonathan and Sarah Taylor eventually relocated to Genesis in their later years, with Jonathan finally admitting to his daughter's great amusement that her unconventional path had proven wiser than he could have imagined. On the 10th anniversary of the founding of Genesis, the town commemorated the occasion by commissioning a bronze plaque for the town square. It bore a simple inscription that captured the spirit of all they had built together. Dreams, like buildings, require both vision and foundation. Genesis. Established 1876, Garrett and Josephine Walker, founders, and so the town that began with mockery and doubt became a monument to possibility, proving that sometimes the dreams others laugh at are precisely the ones most worth fighting for.